Hello and welcome to Love Ballarat, presented by Tales from Rat City. Today we're talking about the Depression years. This might be a bit of a darker time in Ballarat's history, perhaps one that might inspire a bit of fear, especially considering the aftermath of global economic meltdown in the wake of COVID-19. Today's research I'd like to credit is research by Jennifer Beecham, part of her studies on Ballarat Regional Trades and Labour Council, supported by Ballarat Trades Hall and Federation University. The Great Western Bates described the onset of the Depression in Ballarat as like hail out of a clear sky. Even in Ballarat itself, which had never really recovered from the recession of the 1890s and the collapse of the mining boom, the onset of the Depression was rapid and overwhelming. In 1929, and I'll quote here from the Courier, it referred to the season of depression and commented that the demand for help from deserving people stricken with misfortune has become increasingly acute. And as businesses began mass retrenchments and sackings, many men were forced to rostered work, taking weeks off at a time in order to preserve what employment was still available. Single men were often required to take unpaid leave for 1 week out of every 3, and married men 1 week out of every 8. When mass sackings began, the first to go were of course the casuals, often replaced by apprentices who at the end of their tenure were sacked and rehired as casual day labourers. In Australia, unemployment began to soar, reaching 30% in 1932 and remaining at that level for 2 years, only beginning to fall in the latter half of the 1930s. But this number is very difficult to substantiate, and the real number may be a lot higher, as so many men were forced to become itinerant labourers, or swaggies if you like, travelling from place to place in search of work, off the books. It's further complicated that many men living on what was called sustenance labour, the exchange of food for labour, registered at multiple towns in order to feed their hungry families. Fortunately for posterity, many of the stories of Ballarat residents during the 1930s were preserved in 1983 in a series of interviews. And you're about to hear them be reenacted. To begin with, Jim Richards remembers the time as...
At the end of 2019, I was put off at Monaghan, where I was working on a farm. I had a motorbike and a sidecar, and I said to a cobber, well, what about going to Melbourne, looking for work on the way down? No work no matter where you tried. Anyhow, we got to Melbourne, and in Melbourne, well, things were no better than anywhere else. We tried everywhere to get a job, and in the meantime, we saw a bit in the paper about people going prospecting. Some were making money, you know. So I said to my friend, well, what about having a go at it? So we went over to Elstonwick to a bit of a miners' meeting there. We went there and we listened to it and everything else. They gave you the places where the gold was found and everything. So we decided to come up here. We sold the motorbike, bought a tent, picks, shovels and everything. I got on the train to come to Ballarat, and of course when we got to Ballarat we met a chap on the train and we talked about gold mining. And he said, I think the best place to be is to go out to Creswick. And when we got to Ballarat they had a school train about 4 o'clock, so we got on that and we came out to Creswick. We camped at St George's Lake, camped there for 6 months or so. Pretty good people around then, they wouldn't see you stuck for a feed. And that's how I first really got to know the wife and that. And then Grace's auntie was very sick with TB, and she was in a little old hut over the creek there. And the doctors told us to get her out of there and get her into a tent. So they wondered where they'd get a tent from. I came up and I said, you can have mine. It was a fairly big tent. We took it over there and put it up for her, and that's where she stayed, in that tent until she died. And then they had a little old room there and I dossed in there. And that's where I ended up. With the gold mining, we went panning. Alluvial gold was quite available for 2 or 3 years, and we'd get a little bit, enough to keep the wolf from the door. I worked in St George's Reef for about 12 months or a bit more. There were a few good crushings, about ½ an ounce a ton. And then we kept going down. It was a vertical reef, very steep. We kept going down and down and down, and we kept on until we got to water level. We had pumps and that on, but we just couldn't beat the water. The pumps weren't big enough to lift the water out. Of course, it was an old-time, a 3-compartment shaft or something from the early days. So we tried the mines department, and we said we wanted a bigger pump, but they didn't have any on hand. So I went spud digging, doing a few odd jobs. When I came back from spud digging at Miner's Rest, I went back to mining. Well, we weren't working 8 hours, I can tell you that much. I was working up to 12 hours, 14 hours sometimes, because when we got down to the 200-foot level, well, you were too far to hand winch it. We had to do all the underground work, and it started to get a bit poor. We had no crushing going through. It was all pick and shovel. You had a trolley, and that's all, just to get rid of a bit of mullock in that. But it was all pick and shovel explosives. I didn't know how to look for it. I just went around. I walked around the district and I watched the blokes pan and everything. Well, you've got to learn off of whatever you see. And these chaps at the George's Reef, when I was boarding there, well, they were real old-timers. They knew mining from A to Z, and they worked in the big mines in the 80s and the early 90s. You often say, what am I doing down here? But then that's the way nature is. Things are hard. Well, you've just got to do it. And there's always with this gold mining, you're always saying, the next foot is it. You always reckon you'll get it in the next foot. Well, it doesn't come that way. It just doesn't come. You see, when we came into Creswick, it wasn't a bad little town. The people come to your rescue, as the saying goes, but I wasn't the only one. There was 400 people. Blokes like myself come to Creswick to make camps all over the place. Well, they put on dances and social evenings and balls and that, and nearly every night of the week there was a church. The Catholic Church, the Salvation Army, or somebody would have something going on. And there's all these people that would bring supper. Well, that kept us a lot of us going, just the supper. Kept us from starving, as I say, because if you didn't get any money out of gold, you had nothing to buy anything with. And they were a fairly good lot. They were a cosmopolitan lot. There was all sorts. And not all Australians. There were Englishmen, like myself, Irishmen, Scotsmen, and there were Greeks and Italians, everything there were. Czechoslovakian and Yugoslavs and Swedes. In those days, you would go and buy a 4-pound loaf of bread for 10 pennies. Well, try and buy a 4-pound loaf. You can't get one today for under $2. And as far as meat and that was concerned, well, it was mostly rabbits. A lot of the old chaps from around here were rabbiters and that, and they'd go rabbiting, they'd give you a rabbit and that. Spuds were about the cheapest thing you could get. You were living on spuds and rabbits most of the time.
When I was 14, I was looking after families and cooking and washing and ironing and all that. You had a mother that had a baby and you just gave her bread and butter for 3 days. Nothing, just bread and butter. Why? I don't know. But you only gave her bread and butter for 3 days. Nobody worried much about having a doctor. They just had a midwife that came around. You wouldn't let them on their feet for, I can't remember how many days. I mean, you give them gruel, you know, what we used to call gruel. I'm afraid I used to like the gruel too. So when I used to cook, I put a little bit extra in the pot that was made of groats, like an oatmeal kind of thing. Yes, so I looked after as many as 3 in the family, but there was never any money. You never got any money. It was a lot of hard work for me at the time, you know, with me being young. The midwife that I was associated with in the first place was an old lady, Mrs. Warren, and she was really, really, really old, an old lady. I couldn't hazard a guess at how old she was, and she would wash and dress the baby and attend to the mother, whatever had to be done. Well, for instance, the navel of the baby, I used to have a scorched drag ready. She used to have 2 scorched pieces of linen to put on that, so there'd be no infection or anything, and then you'd have all these little bits of linen folded up and you'd scorch it, you know, hold it in front of the fire and you'd scorch it. And she'd just dress the baby and dress that every day with a scorched rag and full as earth. It was a powder. Well, then they'd have, I don't know why all these things were, I just know you had to have them. They would have a flannel binder, a white flannel binder over that pad, and then you dress them in their petticoats. Not like now, just a gown for weeks. Even from when they were born, they had a petticoat and a dress. You dress them and then you put this stiff binder, which I think was supposed to help their back. A really stiff binder, you'd sew it all up. They were dressed and undressed twice a day, and you dress them for the daytime and then you put them into their night attire. I did this for sisters, cousins, anyone that was going to have a baby, and they'd have other children, and that sort of fell into my job, didn't it? Yeah, so I just went along and helped. I can never recall getting any money for it. Well, one time I looked after my cousin's 4 children, and this is when things were bad, and when the sustenance came, and things were really bad, and I got a pair of granny pants. Granny pants with the elastic in the legs and tops. And you got that from a handout. It was a handout from the council rooms. That was my pay for 2 weeks. A pair of shoes, handout shoes, and a pair of granny pants. That was for looking after 4 children. The husband and wife were doing all the cooking, all the working, and looking after the mother and the new baby with the sisters. And when I stop to think of what we used to do when we were young, you really wonder how we ever survived. Because it was very heavy work. You cut wood, you bring it home. I used to carry drinking water from here to where I was born, a quarter of a mile away. 2 kerosene tins I would carry, 1 in each hand. But we used to have a hoop, and an iron hoop, and you'd put that in, that would take the weight or something, I don't know. It helped to carry it. But of course, once I started going with Jim, he used to be very helpful. Well, we eventually decided that we would get engaged, and then we were married over there where I was born. The minister came to the house, and we had a big marquee, and we had 100 people and relatives all at our wedding, people that my father worked for and various other people. And from then on, my life was much easier because I had a tank. And he'd built a home with 2 rooms and a little kitchenette.
A lot of people never knew there was a depression on. I went to school with the son of a butcher. They were a nice family, not stuck up, but they didn't know there was a depression on. I remember up in Dana Street, near Pleasant Street, I was cutting a woman's lawn for 1 shilling an hour. My brother-in-law was working nearby on Susso. The woman had a brand new lawnmower, and Charlie had no tobacco. And he said to me, "Hold on, I have to get a packet of tobacco." So we told the lady that the blades on the mower were dead blunt, and would she give him a shilling to sharpen them? He got his tobacco. You had to battle to survive. You had to live on your wits or starve. That's all there was to it.
And even during the Depression, and we always had our holiday at the sea. And Father was a great believer in that. It was bad while I was nursing, of course, and yet people would manage to employ nurses. Train fares and things like that were cheap, and you could go to Melbourne for £1 return ticket, I think it was in those days. And we were lucky if we went to the pictures once a week, and during the Depression we did stop.
But for many, food and survival day to day were the overwhelming reality of life. In 1930, the dole was introduced to supply bread and potatoes and firewood. A family of 4 was entitled to 2.5 loaves of bread and a 14-pound bag of potatoes once a week, roughly the equivalent of a 5-kilo bag today in modern terms. In April of 1931, the Ballarat Unemployed Relief Committee began to issue food vouchers to those who registered at Ballarat Town Hall. And on the 4th of August, the council instituted a work for sustenance scheme, what became popularly known as SUSO. On May 3rd, 1933, tragedy struck wherein a worker was killed and another seriously injured while working on a sustenance scheme project at the Mount Pleasant Reserve, where a 12-foot-high bank was being broken down to construct a sports ground. There'd been some overnight rain, and the bank, which had become seriously undercut the day before, looked dangerous, and the workers required safety facilities to be installed and the bank to be barred down. And this entailed the removing of the overhanging portion of the bank under which the men were working. And the foreman said, and I quote, "Never mind the bars, get in further and get a good fall." Well, they did get their good fall a few minutes later, when the bank collapsed. 2 workers were buried by the fall. Robert Dakin, 23 years old, was killed instantly, and Stanley Bradley was badly injured. The funeral became a protest under the conditions under which the Susso schemes were enacted on the population. And there were frustrations about unscrupulous practices by businesses using it to undercut paid labour by contract and paid employees, and exploitation through both council and business avenues. Bill Roberts recalls of this time.
Veggies. You had to grow your own veggies. Yes, oh God, yes. And then you used to have to go around and beg for seed. You wouldn't have enough money for seed for carrots and parsnip seeds, so some of them, they'd put you onto someone else that had seed and all that kind of thing. See, there was a lot of gardeners around in them times that would sell carrots and parsnips. We wouldn't buy seeds. You would ask for seed, you'd beg for seed, and then they would give it to you. In those days, there was never anyone turned down. Like, as far as your neighbour was concerned, what one couldn't have, the other would have. So we got a deposit. We put a deposit on the place. We had to pay about £3 a week. We had some, and our mum's sister came to the rescue to loan us the other. Families would all come together. Well, my lovely wife never missed one payment, and the place was paid off as it is today. Never missed one payment. And there was no back gate, there was no bath. Well, the bath had a hole in it. Out the back, the old copper. And not only us, I've seen people washing in kerosene tins. Well, we had to wash in the copper. It would take us about 2 hours to make it boil, and everything was done by hand, kiddies' napkins and everything else. You have no idea what Mum had done like in them days. My brother Tom, the eldest boy, he served his time at Long's as a confectioner, and when they sold out, he bought the machinery. Tom started out on his own, and the Depression came then, in 1931, about that, and Tom had a very bad time. They wanted him to sell his lollies for about 3p a pound, and he was paying 2p halfpenny for the sugar. He said, "No, I can't do it. I'm paying 2p halfpenny for the sugar, and I have all my other things to buy. All different colourings and essence and things." He said, "I just can't afford it." Well, he couldn't carry on. They wouldn't buy the lollies, and he couldn't sell them, so he got into sustenance. I can see Tom's hands now, because he had these beautiful white hands with the lolly making. They were soft, you know. And he got a job there, as with a pick and a shovel and that. You should have seen his hands. They were all bleeding, awful, you know. Terrible, I thought, but he stuck to it, and he died later on. There was quite a lot of men on Susso. I thought a lot of the work they did was useless work. I mean to say, lots of corners where there were crossings, they used to have a piece of land. You couldn't build on it, so they would put sustenance men onto it to plant a lawn or something. The lawn would come up all right, but later on, that was the end of it. They didn't worry about it, they didn't attend to it. It was just absolutely useless work.
The Depression hit Australia with savagery. Our dependence on mass exports of primary produce, like today, left Australia incredibly vulnerable to the vagaries of global demand. And we were, besides the Weimar Republic of Germany, one of the hardest hit nations in the world. While the economy did begin to recover through the late 1930s, unemployment only dropped below 10% in 1937. But for many people, poverty was a reality of life right through the 30s and the war years. For many, of course, it didn't stop until the onset of global war and its aftermath. The experience of the Great Depression left an indelible mark on Australian and, of course, Ballarat culture. Our society and even the environment are profoundly shaped by this experience. I often ponder now when I walk around Wurruk'urrung State Forest near Canadian. We see the mine shafts there, some are still open. Were these left over from the grand old days of the gold rush, or were these redug by desperate men like this Jim Richards in the 1930s? The legacy is there all around us today, and something that we always need to keep in mind with regards to the fragility of our prosperity and wealth. This has been Love Ballarat, presented by Tales from That City, and I'd like to thank Ballarat Trades Hall and Jenny Beecham for the contribution of their research. Thank you very much. We can answer any questions. Okay, so we don't have any questions there, but thank you very much. And of course, thank you very much, Shannon Nichols and Katrina Hill, our actors for today. And I hope you've enjoyed this session. Thank you very much.